And one of the stories that is coming up, and I don't know right now, it's a movie, and there are people who are saying all movie theaters should close, all concerts should be canceled. If the University of Virginia is sending all the students home, what's the point of keeping Charlottesville open? Who knows where it's going to go? But as of right now, there is a very cool movie coming out. It is called Climate Hustle 2. It's actually starring a fellow that we had on several years ago from CPAC, Kevin Sorbo, is starring in it. And actually, in the trailer, you might recognize our own friend Chris Horner, author of Red Hot Lies, Power Grab, the politically incorrect guide to global warming. Are you featured in the movie, or are you just in the trailer, Chris? Good morning.
Good morning. I haven't seen it yet. We will see it when it comes out. That's Earth Day, of course. Some of you may know it as Lennon's birthday, but on April 21st, it will be out in various cities. I think 720 theaters around the country, including Charlottesville.
I love this. I don't know if you've seen any of these other Fathom events. We saw Christmas Jars as a Fathom event, and we've done. I really kind of like this way of getting kind of the independent films out there that aren't going to get, Warner Brothers Studios or Harvey Weinstein to produce their films for them. Maybe that was a bad example, but it's not going to get a 12-week run on 700 screens, but it can get on 700 screens on a 1 or 2 day event. I kind of like that model.
I think it's great, and I've seen some online discussion of how far out they can get it, and it's going to depend upon the Earth Day showing. This is Earth Day turns 50, so by then I think we'll be talking. The media being the media, they'll shift off of this coronavirus. I suspect by then, and we'll get to the long-planned, orgiastic coverage of Earth Day turns 50 in time.
Well, do you think? Can you imagine if Earth Day got canceled because of coronavirus?
See, there's a silver lining to everything.
I guess so.
Think of all of the litter that won't be left at all of the Earth Day celebrations if we confront that.
Well, is there a commonality, at least in terms of style points and perhaps the method of which they're ginning up this economic crisis around a illness that so far still isn't the most deadly in many places? Only 30 or so people tragically in the United States. I'm not belittling it, but most of them either had been on a Princess cruise ship. I'm glad the Love Boat isn't on TV anymore, and or in this retirement community in northern, I guess, Washington state. So, it seems to be places like Italy and China with their socialized medicine system and their keep it quiet. I heard that China didn't even report their first case for 3 months while they were trying to contain it, I guess, is what it was. But, there's a lot of what they're doing with coronavirus that is reminiscent of the way they've dealt with climate change.
It seems inescapable that if you look at certain parties who, for their own reasons, we can just call it different twists on Rahm Emanuel's never let a crisis go to waste philosophy, whether it's Trump derangement, whether it's an obsession with the media's predispositions with which you're very familiar. Mm-hmm. I think it's inarguable that there's a great unknown out there, but the coverage doesn't quite match. There's a great unknown out there, and I think let's take it to the climate context now. There's unknown out there, but we know an awful lot more than we did when the coverage first became hysterical, and there's so much reason to not be hysterical now, and yet the coverage is only more hysterical. We see this like in Animal House every spring, the toilets explode, etc. We keep being told every year it's now worse than previously thought. And if you go back and check what they previously thought, it was that Antarctica would be the only habitable continent soon. So it just doesn't add up. And that Britain, you remember in 2004, I think, a secret Pentagon report says Britain will be something uninhabitable by 2020. I don't subscribe to any UK newspapers, so somebody might check. But it's just remarkable, and yet we continue to get this bilge of and worse than we thought. So that impulse is there. It's there among particular people. It's certainly there among the media. It's heightened when they feel they can tie it to Trump. You've saw it during Bush. I will just go back in the climate context again. Remember when I was like the guy you couldn't notice me now, like the guy standing on a street corner in a surgical mask, muttering to himself when I was talking about this evil company Enron I had experienced.
Mm-hmm.
Before they thought they could tie its collapse to Bush. And nobody wanted to hear about how this company was setting up this enormous scheme to make a fortune off of doing nothing, which turned out to be an Enron MO. But they were doing it, they invented the climate industry, and I know because I was in the room. As I say, I'm very difficult to disown of this, having been in the room at the same time for Enron with certain hydrocarbon interests, Union of Concerned Scientists, and so on, in a fancy New York law firm's conference room trying to figure out how to get a global warming treaty. And this just struck me, as you might imagine, as a little off. Enron didn't care for my views on this, and thus ended a brilliant several-week relationship with Enron. But I was attempting to explain this to parties for some time until Enron collapsed and it became a George W. Bush issue. And suddenly, the Washington Post, the NewsHour, the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, I believe it was at the time, they all wanted to talk to me because suddenly we could tie it to Bush.
Right.
And I spent 40-something minutes discussing this with a reporter with Washington Post. I don't remember his name. I think it was Dan. He was one of their lead political guys. And he sat there in the CEI conference room seeming to listen to me for about 45 minutes explaining these schemes. And I remember he tapped his temple with the pencil and said, I suppose I could say you're telling me they weren't that bad after all? I said, well, have you been listening to anything I said? And he says, well, I mean, global warming, it was still global warming at the time.
Right.
Yeah. I said, so I see the depth of thought here. Global warming, it must be okay. But you're now realizing they were all about these accounting gimmicks and trying to make money off doing nothing, and whether it's with barges or carbon dioxide credits. So that's a very long diversion about the instinct is they cannot contain themselves, and we'd like to get into mitigation, but we can't contain this among media. But I think it's inescapable here, and of course they've done what they do, and they've said this is also climate change.
Chris Horner is on with us, author of Red Hot Lies, Power Grab, Politically Incorrect Guide with the Government Accountability and Oversight law firm. But I have to ask, because I'm still waiting for the follow-up, and we've been talking about the Climate Hustle 2, which is coming out April 21st. Charlottesville's got showings, and get to see it. Kevin Sorbo in it. But I watched a little of the Hillary reinvention documentary, and she keeps shrugging off, saying, I don't know what the big deal was about all my emails. Everyone else did it. When you watch China try to cover up the outbreak in the Wuhan province for 3 months, while you continue to watch people try to work behind closed doors, especially in collusion over whether there was any collusion in the Ukraine or in Russia or with whoever they want to say there's collusion in. Do we need a chapter 2 or a volume 2 on the Politically Incorrect Guide to or the liberal liberal war on transparency? Pardon me.
Well, I have to say we've learned an awful lot more, but I do have to respond to the comment from Hillary and from Lisa Jackson / Richard Windsor. Whenever they're caught, they say everybody does it, but they never point out who these other people are, because there are no other examples. When we caught the EPA administrator under Barack Obama using a false identity, it was not a secondary email account, which everybody has, and it still says at the bottom, Administrator Christy Whitman or so on. It doesn't say Richard Windsor. It says, the Federal Records Act requires that you identify the parties and so on. You can't pretend to be someone else. And that's what she was doing. And she said, well, everybody does it. And they threw out a bunch of it with Senator Barbara Boxer trying to put out the fire, threw out a bunch of examples of people doing something completely different. No one was ever documented as having done that. No one was ever documented, to my knowledge, as having done what Hillary did. Yeah, several people had. I think it was the agricultural education secretaries had accounts that were not easily discernible, but nobody had a false identity like a cabinet level official. Nobody had a server who decided, you know what, I would be asked anyway whether they were anything I should turn over, and I'm just going to destroy them because my answer would be no. And I heard that clip from the documentary.
The Lisa Jackson thing,
quite
though.
how it worked.
The Lisa Jackson thing is, of course, as you point out, she was working with Greenpeace or the Sierra Club, and they were actually working on ways to get the agenda pushed forward. I mean, this was collusion, but long before Russia or the Ukraine.
Right. There were people contacting Richard Windsor to set up a meeting with Lisa Jackson, in case you're wondering whether she was putting it off as being someone else. When she did when she would seek amplification of Sierra Club work or something, that was done on her Verizon account on the BlackBerry on the other side of her hip. She had several instruments, numerous accounts. What we know about the working with the Green Group presidents was done on the Verizon account. We also know when the Siemens lobbyists contacted her, she had a General Buck Turgidson moment and said, "I told you never to contact me here." She said, "You can use my home account," and sent her to Verizon, I think. That was really a promiscuous. No one did precisely what we've seen her doing, but this idea of trying to move things off record was really a promiscuous practice in the Obama administration. It has gone on now. We have found, obviously, they're using these disappearing messaging services, and there's a problem with that. They're using. There's something called Wicker that attorneys general are using.
Mm-hmm.
All sorts of highly questionable activities for one purpose, which is to hide what they're doing in a public office using taxpayer resources in pursuing public policy, typically with outside interests. And, of course, that's wrong, and these laws aren't to provide hooks to. They're not called disclosure laws. They're not called withholding laws. And the courts are clear on this. They're called disclosure laws. Everything's a public record, and you put it out unless you can identify one of these reasons why it isn't an exception. If it falls into that, it's embarrassing isn't an exception. I don't want people to read it isn't an exception. But you see that invoked all the time. But as we and others had success, you saw these parties moving public business over to private means. And I don't know if you know, but right before we've spoken, there's been another revelation about notes.
Really?
Handwritten notes, typewritten notes, in which one state that's filing these climate lawsuits was admitting that it isn't because they have all these losses or because of some conceived catastrophe that they're sure of. The notes show the departmental director in Rhode Island confessing at the Rockefeller Mansion to peers from 14 other states that it was because the legislature in Rhode Island is conservative Democrat and doesn't care about ENVT. And we're looking for a sustainable funding stream. So we're suing Big Oil in state court. And you could say, well, that's ambiguous. I could read it three different ways. The problem is two people took notes. And they both must have misheard her in precisely the same way because they wrote down the same thing, looking for sustainable funding stream.
Oh, gosh.
That's what this is about. It's a grab for revenue. And that's why public records are so important. And you can't let them get away with moving things offline. And yet they're all trying to do it.
And they're all trying to claim that it's for your own good or for the best interest. Certainly law enforcement for rent. Your report at Government Accountability Oversight law firm is it's governmentaccountability.org, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not looking at the website right now.
Govoversight.org.
Govoversight.
You can find those emails too. You can find those emails and handwritten notes about working with the trial bar. It's just, you and I spoke for several years about how there's going to have to be a sequel. This just never ends. It truly isn't ending. It's getting much worse. The good news is we are finding things, but we're also finding tricks to avoid getting caught out. So clearly we're not learning everything that we should. The old joke about it's a good thing we don't have all the government we paid for. Where would we put it? There's so much more to learn about how these institutions are being used.
Right.
But we're having some success, but it's quite clear that sometimes with the assistance of the courts, they're getting away with a lot too.
Mm-hmm.
Just one note of not a victory lap yet. The governor could always exercise his line item veto, but the Virginia legislature just restored the prohibition on the Attorney General entering that Bloomberg.
They restored it. This General Assembly restored it.
They did. The House of Delegates stripped it. Governor Northam stripped it from his budget. The House of Delegates would not include it in their budget. Delegate Charles Poindexter brought up an amendment to restore this prohibition on Mike Bloomberg hiring special assistant attorneys general.
Right, and the only attorney generals could be, or only staffers could be ones paid by the state, if I remember the law.
Right, the law is the law, and apparently it wasn't enough law for the AG's office. And that case is still going on. The AG said, yeah, I promised that it was ethical, and I promised it was okay. It was statutorily permissible. There were no problems. But there are 4 Virginia laws that should have raised serious questions about this. And the AG's office is still insisting to the court in Richmond that it didn't write anything down about this. Lawyers tend to look things up and write them down. They're saying they didn't. They just spaced on it and talked about it at the water cooler in one memorable moment from oral argument a few months. So that's great. It's now in the state's 2-year budget. You can see Delegate Poindexter raising the amendment and saying, essentially, be careful what you say is okay. You're not always going to be in charge. You could have an NRA or ExxonMobil special assistant attorney general, too. And you could see and hear people getting uncomfortable. And he said, so let's vote this up. Let's keep Virginia clean. And the peanut gallery didn't like that. You can see it online. I think Climate Litigation Watch links to that, directs you to where to watch it. But the Senate in conference forced it back in, and good on them. And so now it's up to whether the governor will protect the AG and say, we don't need no prohibitions on what you've been caught trying to do, and line item veto it out. Otherwise, Virginia remains the only state that's actually stood up and said, not here, not on our watch. Several other states are considering it, by the way, after Virginia did this. Minnesota said they were going to try to follow Virginia's example and so on. So Virginia showed a clean example, and others are seeking to follow it. So a rare moment of very good news.
Well, and certainly ironic, since all of this journey began with the Attorney General of Virginia asking one of his clients, the University of Virginia, to provide him documents so that we could be clear that we weren't violating the Fraud Against Taxpayers Act many, many moons ago, and then exit Ken Cuccinelli, enter Chris Horner in his chase after Michael Mann, chronicled a good bit in Climate Hustle, but maybe some of it in Climate Hustle too, Chris. I don't know. Certainly the latest should be. They are looking forward to it. And thank you again for catching up with us. And that's great stuff about the General Assembly, despite itself actually getting it right.
And can I say, I saw Climate Hustle, actually went to the premiere in Paris. It was during the climate talks, and they made a great show of it. It was Patrick Moore, and there was a giant polar bear and a stretch limo and all sorts of Mark Morano showmanship. It was a lot of fun. I was there with Dellingpole, Moncton, the usual suspects, and I can't guarantee you're going to find Dellingpole and Moncton at all of these theaters, but we did have a rollicking good time at the movie. I expect this one will be just as entertaining, and I look forward to it.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking some time out with us this morning. It's been too long, and I just felt like I needed to catch up with Chris Horner and get at least a daily dose of it in.
My pleasure. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. On Joe Thomas in the Morning.